One thing I want to say right now is we are scheduling for a little bit of Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, which hopefully there will be lots, try and wait until we're done. We should have 10 or 15 minutes, and or we can do the hallway and everything else. So I think we're good to go. General outline, if you want an idea of what we're going to talk about and decide you hate it, feel free to leave now or whenever you want. There's a lot to try and cover, and we can't quite do everything. So hopefully we'll touch on a lot of really important points throughout this talk. So I am Mavhead. I'm a senior information security engineer, member of Austin Hackers Anonymous. Might have picked up on that one. DEF CON security goon, general volunteer junkie, including audio-visual stuff for a lot of conferences. One thing I do want to say, though, is semi-personal disclaimer. I did formerly work for a vulnerability management company. That's where a lot of this comes from, was consulting with probably over 100 different customers. So despite that, we're going to still try and be pretty neutral on vendors.
I am Digital Grease. I work in InfoSec as a security engineer. Little side note, if there's anybody who's trying to get into InfoSec and maybe doesn't have like a college degree or something like that, a little hard work will get you really, really far. I used to be a mechanic, so now instead of just can you fix my computer, I get can you fix my computer and can you fix my car?
All right, so we're going to start out with a disclaimer. It'll be one of the few things we read incomplete. We do not attest to the fitness of any product or service. We certainly don't attest to fitness of any kind.
We are not lawyers. If you don't believe we're not lawyers, ask our lawyers. If you are a lawyer, we probably need lawyers.
All right, so we're going to walk through a little bit of expectations just around the talk itself, and again, give you an opportunity to decide you're in the wrong room and go see somebody much, much better. So first, we are going to really try and be agnostic as far as vendors or products goes. Despite my previous experience, I then spent 2 years working defense using the biggest competitor's product. So at this point, we're not going to try and have product-specific features or functionality and really make this broad as possible.
Prerequisites for this talk is you should have used or configured a vulnerability management product, be running scans and creating reports, and maybe have experienced some of the challenges of a vulnerability management program.
General knowledge, similar. Hopefully you've got some hands-on work. You're familiar with creating scans or sites, templates, reports. This is not entirely required, but you will better understand the problems and some of the goals that we've outlined.
Some common problems that you run into in vulnerability management is too many vulnerabilities and poor reporting on them, lack of upper management support for remediations, and other departments viewing you as a blocker to what they're trying to do.
So general roles is trying to become a bit more risk-focused, focusing on risk versus vulnerabilities, scoped reporting, and definitely things like accuracy and quickness, speed. As we get through this, hopefully these should start to become more apparent, some of the things we're trying to address.
The audience for this is the people who use these products every day, familiar with the processes, and those people who may be able to influence change in order to fix some of those processes.
You'll find that while a lot of this is on the technical side, some of it is more on kind of the high-level philosophical side, and so there are many things you can't necessarily change unless you're in a position of influence, which is certainly a challenge. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is just general life cycle. This is very important because, as many of us hopefully have learned by now, there's not an end goal. Security is not going to be done. Vuln management is not going to be done. It's just going to keep happening over and over again. I did not build out your standard life cycle slide because there's 100 different variations on things like discovery and prioritize and all of that sort of stuff. What I did do is actually kind of my new favorite, starting in the top right, of just plan, do, check, act. It is important to make this a life cycle. You are not done. Even when something is remediated, it's probably going to come back, and you still have to have that life cycle in place. So maturity level. Much of this talk very much relies on maturity. We're going to say this over and over again and keep rehashing it. You can't do everything immediately. So a lot of this stuff, we may recommend a best practice or an end goal, and you may say, well, that's just not possible. I can't get to that point yet. Just keep that in mind, that you may be starting at a lower maturity level and working towards some of these ideas. So this is definitely not a full list of potential milestones for maturity, but having things like asset inventory and patch management are really going to be important. If you have some of them right now, that will be incredibly helpful. If you have absolutely none of them, then that gives you an idea of where you might be starting from a maturity level. And how am I doing on the mic? It's all over the place. Everyone hear me okay? Sweet. Keeps dancing around.
So we're going to start this off talking about some do's and don'ts, and starting with your patching approach. There are generally two schools of thought, where either vulnerability management tells you what all you need to patch, or vulnerability management tells you what you missed after you've already patched. Some don'ts that you should avoid is don't patch things only when they're on fire. You should not patch just because there's some new named Hollywood vulnerability with a logo and a website. That is not the only time that you should be patching things. Another thing is don't chase vulnerability counts. It's not helpful to tell somebody that there's 30,000 vulnerabilities on a particular system, because that is unmanageable. And do not prioritize based on CVSS. It is a valuable metric to use, but it's also a very static metric and does not take a lot of things into account, like asset criticality or age or the availability of an exploit. Some things you should do are adopt a regular patching cadence. Now, this may be different based on your organization, whether it's bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever, but...
Never.
Never. But a regular patching cadence will avoid a ton of problems before they can ever happen. Another thing that you should do is, instead of chasing vulnerabilities, chase remediations. If you go to somebody with, like I said, your server has 4,000 vulnerabilities, they're immediately going to shut down and stop listening to you because they can't do anything about that. But if you say, hey, there's 2 remediations you need to do, that's manageable and something they feel like they can accomplish. And another thing that you should absolutely do is utilize risk score. The big vulnerability management products have their own risk scores available, which is a combination of usually CVSS and those other things like asset criticality and age and exploit availability, that gives you a more usable weighted score to sort of organize things by.
All right, so a little bit on architecture and deployment. This is kind of focusing on hardware requirements, number of scanners, placement of scanners. This is a very broad topic, so we obviously can't cover quite everything, but hopefully can give some good takeaways. So, for the love of God, don't use the minimum requirements. I saw this all the time, and still to this day see this frequently from friends that are telling me, hey, my system's really slow, my scans take too long. So those minimums are minimums for a reason. Don't virtualize. Raise your hand who's currently got a virtualized vulnerability console, server, primary. Okay. We'll talk a little more about why in the do, but a big part here is generally people are not dedicating resources. Generally your console or server needs to be 64 gigs of RAM up to maybe 196 gigs of RAM, and you're not going to be putting that into a virtualization cluster. So this ties in with being under-resourced. So don't share the system. If you're running Metasploit Pro and Nexpo's on the same thing, or you're running Tenable and Bro Network Monitor, whatever it got renamed to, you're going to wind up suffering from a lot of resource problems. And again, either your CPU, your memory, or your disk I/O is going to completely tank. And definitely do not ignore network topology. If you've got DMZ, hopefully, or a cardholder data environment, the placement and position of your scanners is going to be very critical to your success. So you're not punching firewall holes through 19 firewalls from your scanner all the way into your protected network. Do allocate enough resources. Again, RAM, CPU, and especially disk I/O. A lot of people don't think about that one, but for on-prem TVM, your disk I/O is very often the biggest bottleneck, even more so on your scanner or on your consoles or your primary server than it is your scanners. Definitely deploy enough scanners. Frequently I saw way too many people that had 3 scanners for 50,000 IPs and they had 25 offices around the world. That does not scale. So if you've got a large data center with 20,000 systems, you're probably going to need a couple of scanners. If you've got 100 offices, you may not necessarily need 100 scanners, but you're probably going to want to make sure you're doing regionalized scanners and things like that. Tune the OS, database, application. This applies far less to the cloud, which is why most vendors are going there. But again, if your OS can support some kind of tuning, either at the file system level or generally application priority, especially things like if it does have a database, if it's a database you have the ability to customize and tweak, do so. Because once you scale above probably 10,000 IPs, if you haven't done this, you're going to run into a lot of bottlenecks. And then monitor resource utilization. If you're not paying attention to what your resource looks like during a scan or during a large import to your console or your primary server, how are you ever going to know when suddenly you're bottlenecking again? And frequently I would see customers that were simply deploying at a certain size, then growing and having no clue that they had been bottlenecking on 3 out of 10 of their scanners. So whether you're using more than likely some kind of third-party thing through SNMP or IPMI or whatever, make sure you're monitoring much like a sysadmin would.
So some important things about discovery scanning and frequency are, well, first of all, discovery scanning is critical because you may think that you know what's on your network, but you probably don't. And a secondary to that is that vuln management tools, while they can be used to supplement, are not asset management tools, even though some people like to treat them as such. That's not what they're for, that's not what they're due, and that's really not what they're good at. Some things you should not do is assume that you know everything. Things constantly change on a network. You have systems getting decommed, there's some developer standing something up over here to do whatever he's doing. There's always things changing on your network. You cannot at any given time know exactly what there is without doing some kind of discovery sweep. Do not blindly trust your asset management, assuming that you have asset management.
If you don't, that solves that problem.
Yeah. Even a good asset management system is still fallible. It may not get updated properly, it may not get updated frequently enough, and because of that, you will miss things that exist on your network. Do not do wide, broad-reaching discovery sweeps without notifying people. If you're going to scan an entire /8 in your network, you should probably let people know about that, because it's going to scare some people, it's going to break other people's deployments, and you're generally just going to cause a huge problem for tons of people. Do not rely on ad hoc scans. Ad hoc scans, which may be necessary every once in a while, they will muddle up your scan schedule, they will throw off your scan windows, and they'll use scan resources when you really don't need them to. Things that you should do are discovery sweep regularly. Because things change so frequently and you never really know what changes have taken place, having a regular cadence at which you do discovery sweeps gives you some idea of a baseline of where your network is. You can use discovery sweeps to supplement your asset management. While it may not be asset management, They will frequently find things that your asset management system has missed or did not know about. So they very well supplement each other. You should schedule and notify any stakeholders before running broad-ranging sweeps like I spoke about. If they're going to be doing network maintenance, you should probably let the network guys know. And then if that's not going to work for them, you can work out a different time to do your discovery sweep. And you should definitely consider criticality and resources. Criticality of an asset can play a huge role in how frequently you should scan it. For instance, if you have a PCI enclave, you're probably going to want to scan that way more frequently than random developer's workstation. And kind of a little side note on the resources side of things is if you want to avoid using network resources and system resources, agents are a great way to do that. You completely bypass using your scan engine's resources and any network resources, and all of it is done on the host.
All right, so vulnerability scanning. Don't build scans for your environment. Specifically, what I kind of mean here is that many vulnerability scanner templates, policies will let you do things like turn on or off certain plugins or checks. The problem is when you start scanning a list of Windows servers and you disable everything that's not a Windows server, what happens when suddenly in that subnet or by accidentally in that list of assets, you get a non-Windows system? Now you're blind. So don't use untuned default scan templates or policies. While they'll get you started, you really need to tailor them for your environment, looking at things like timeouts or retries, what network performance impact it might have, what ports it is or isn't scanning. All of these things are very important. And lastly, do not scan static lists of assets. Anything that is static in the product is going to be the devil. Do build scans for your environment. So while this is the same as the don't, what I mean here is focus on things like if you have IoT devices or SCADA, or you've got a portion of your network that's got a low-speed connection, you're going to want to tweak your scans to accommodate those systems. Just don't start pulling out plugins that you think aren't going to be executed or needed, because the products are smart enough to do that themselves. Definitely consider your scan requirements. This ties into things like your scan window, blackouts, whether people are in or out of the office. Scanning a corporate network used to be a royal pain before agents because you had a very small window during the time period of the time zone the office was in to catch your employees and coworkers. So think about those things. It's one of the biggest pieces of a deployment. And then lastly, scan everything. The motto I've always used is scan everything all the time. How practical is that? Do the best you can. A lot of things like the integrations with DHCP servers, Active Directory, and especially agents are making this easier and easier. But the common thing I used to see was customers that were basically scanning only my Windows servers in production and only this one tier of system in court. And that was only 10% of the network. So authentication versus unauthenticated scans. This is one of the areas I'm most passionate about, but it's also one of the areas that very frequently leads to infighting between security and everyone else who owns the actual systems. Any show of hands on who currently is using credentials in their scans? Okay, awesome to see. So the way I like to explain this is with a little analogy. When you buy a house, you have to get a home inspection. The inspector will go inside the house, look in closets, maybe pull up floorboards if they're really aggressive, look inside cabinets and pull up carpet. They're going to go very deep and very thorough. So the question I have is, would you ever buy a house where the home inspection was done by looking through the window from the outside? Because that's what happens when you don't use credentials. You'll never know about water damage, you won't know about molds, you won't know about termites. I know there's a lot of reasons why people don't use credentials, but it makes you blind to a lot of stuff. So don't skip this. I say this knowing that a lot of people don't have a good ability to do this. Agents are definitely helping, But the point I would make here is fight for this. If you have to fight for 2, 3, 4 years, fight for it and don't ever stop. So don't use passwords if you're doing credentials. We'll come back a little bit to that as an alternative, but you potentially can expose a credential that's on every single system in your environment, and now you're compromised in many other ways. Oops. Don't think you're safe. I ran into many situations where I'd run a report for a manager and it would show, oh, you only have 7% systems with critical vulnerabilities. That's awesome. And then I'm like, let me check my accuracy. Do we have credentials on those systems? No, the credentials stopped working. That means it's only showing 7% because I'm blind to 90% of the vulnerabilities on this server. So even if you think you're using credentials, don't assume you are safe and that your data is accurate. Definitely utilize agents. Not everything can run an agent, but a portable laptop that is used by most of your employees will greatly benefit from agents, because then even if they're on holiday or away from the office, they're still getting scanned. Definitely utilize things like keys and certs. A lot of protocols, unfortunately, won't allow this, but anywhere you can use this in place of a password, I strongly recommend it. And lastly, much like the think you're safe, you need to monitor for failures. You need to make sure that if you know you've put credentials into a certain part of your network and they should be functioning, that you have some kind of metrics or dashboards that are going to monitor for when that failure rate suddenly increases, because the technical team made a change on the server and now all of your credentials got disabled. Still me. Poll quick for the audience. Do you have a high-level risk management or risk acceptance process in place? Very few hands. So,
I didn't realize this was a hand raising.
yep, sorry. This is a raise your hand. So again, high level, not just TVM, but I mean for the business itself.
So we're raising our hand for yes, we do.
Yes, you have that in place. So it looks like about a third of the room. So follow-up question to raise your hand. Do you have the authority to accept risk for your entire business? Not a hand went up. Short story I like to tell is that when I used to do trainings on this, I would ask this question. And one day in one of my trainings, the CISO of the company was in it. I still asked the question, thinking it was more rhetorical, and expecting him to say, I absolutely do. And instead he said, heck no. The people I push the risk acceptance to are the vice presidents and senior leaders of whatever business unit the risk lives with. This is critical because you don't want to go above your pay grade. It's very common whenever I inherit a new vulnerability management system, when I go to a new company, that I see dozens of exclusions. And why? Who authorized those? What reason do they exist? Oh, we just got breached, and it's because we didn't know the vulnerability was there because someone added an exception for a reason no one knows about. Definitely do not use these to silence alerts. It is very common. You scan 1,000 Windows systems, you see some minor TCP/IP vulnerability. Yeah, it's more of an irritant. Let's just add an exclusion for that across the entire product. That will get you in big trouble if you start abusing that and you don't follow some kind of high-level process. And definitely don't set your exceptions too broadly. If you've got one port or one service on a class of servers, don't exclude the entire server class. I see that very frequently where it's like, oh, well, if you scan this vendor's black box product, it'll crash. So just simply don't scan it at all. No. Figure out what's crashing it, figure out if it's a service, a check, and try to narrow that down. So let's definitely leverage risk management programs. Large amount of people have them. If you don't, this goes back to maturity. It's very difficult to do this right when your vulnerability management program doesn't have a business program to plug into. Definitely automate the creation or the process around exceptions and exclusions. Ideally, what you'd have is a business application or system that other people are putting risk and acceptance into, and when it's accepted by the manager, director, the VP, that triggers an API call into your product that adds the exception. We don't want to be doing that manually. And then definitely review on a cycle. Saw a lot of people that wouldn't even bother ever reviewing their exceptions, period. Let alone when I'd walk in and inherit the product and be like, when was this added? I don't know, 3 years ago.
So reporting and ownership is kind of complicated, and we can't get into everything here. But another quick poll: who has either received or sent a multi-thousand line CSV report? Yeah.
Fess up.
Was it successful or useful?
No.
Yeah.
So vuln management can be a tool for successfully manipulating your upper management to accomplish some goals that your security team might have.
We apologize if you're upper management and you just heard that.
But what you have to do is you have to translate a lot of these useful metrics into financial risk to the company, because that's what they care about. Don't send massive lists as reports. There is absolutely nobody that will be useful to. It does not communicate risk or prioritization, and really it's just going to irritate people. Do not focus on severity or vulns. Severity isn't a granular enough thing to focus on, and it's usually based on CVSS scores, which, as we discussed previously, are static and don't take a lot of things into account. Vulnerabilities don't communicate risk, and they don't scale for remediation if there's 100,000 of them. Don't assume ownership of a system. If you're just going to assume that because this machine is in prod, then so-and-so owns it because they own everything in prod, that's not a good assumption to make. Somebody's going to own the OS, and then maybe somebody else owns the database on there, and then maybe somebody else owns a service that's also running on there. So you have 3 different owners for this one system. Do prioritize things. You cannot remediate everything. That's just not feasible. Use the risk score I spoke about before, which is weighted and takes a lot of those other things into account to help prioritize, and communicate these priorities with other teams and departments to try to narrow down what things are more important than the other things. Scope appropriately. You can use groups and tagging inside the products to better organize your assets and define owners of systems and groups of different kinds of assets. And scope your reporting with a goal in mind. Like, when you begin writing a report, say, I want to fix this problem, so I need to report metrics that are relevant to this problem and translate that into a risk. And match your reporting to your business. The way you define ownership and do reporting should be matched to the way that your organization is organized. If you're going by department or server class or things like that, your reporting should match that. You should also work with these teams that you're reporting to determine what kind of data they want and how they want to receive it. Maybe this one developer really does actually want a huge CSV file, and for him that's okay. But you need to work with different teams and find out what they want.
So a major question when defining things like SLAs and SLOs for vulnerability management is asking the question, are these for patching, remediation, risk acceptance? That strategy and approach will define a lot of what you do around SLAs and SLOs. The biggest point though is it needs to be auditable. I've frequently walked into a company either as an employee or a consultant and saw that they gave this timeline for this thing, but it really wasn't auditable. So they had the SLAs sort of in place, they were defined, but they didn't really have a good way of making sure that they were actually being met. So as we keep saying, and you've heard, don't focus just on the direct vulnerabilities. We'll talk more about this in the do, but this definitely ties into maturity. A lot of times when you're starting out, you're going to have to focus on the vulnerabilities. You're going to have to just target a particular SLA for remediation around a type of vulnerability, a severity for a vulnerability. but that really shouldn't be the long-term goal. We want to shift to risk. Definitely don't pick one size fits all. You can't say that everything that's a CVSS 7 and above must be remediated within 14 days and everything that's a CVSS 10 is remediated in 24 hours. That doesn't always scale. If you've got black box vendors that you have to wait for patches, when does your SLA start? You still have to assume and mitigate risk, so you can't hold for a vendor patch. So you have to make sure and define these across different teams, across different product areas, parts of your network. The one size fits all will honestly just anger a lot of other people that are being held accountable for those SLAs. And then don't focus just on patch availability. Like I said, if a Cisco vulnerability comes out and you have to wait a week for them to build something, you can't just say, well, the SLA starts when that patch is available. Because if you're approaching this from a risk perspective, the risk starts as soon as you know that it exists and it's there in your environment. You have to have some kind of mitigation or plan in place. So just focusing on patch availability is very dangerous. Focus on risk based on maturity and definitely align with business criticality. Your SLAs or SLOs may not always be the same depending on where in the environment we're talking about. Again, this goes back to moving away from just static CVSS and severity scoring and really talking about risk and what matters based on the asset itself and where it is, what its exposure is, and everything else.
So automation is a great, wonderful thing that can help every aspect of your TVM program. The main things you want to look for when automating things are removing administrative overhead, data aggregation and enrichment, and improving the time that it takes you to come to these remediations. Don't depend on manual processes. Manual processes means that there are humans involved, and humans are finicky and get things wrong because that's what we do.
And they go on vacation or go to conferences.
And they go on vacation or go to conferences, or they're out sick. Depending on manual processes depends on people, and it wastes labor hours. There's no reason to have this developer spending an hour a week doing this process he has to do every single week, especially if he's been working here for 2 years and he's been doing it for 2 years. Don't automate things just because. That same developer, if he does something that takes him 5 minutes that he does once a week, that's probably not worth automating. Don't automate monolithically. And what I mean by that is if you have a huge process with a ton of steps, and it's a very important process, don't try to automate the process as a whole, because that does not scale and that is not maintainable. What you should do is automate your data flows, which reduces manual interaction, less humans in the mix, and it also reduces your dependence on static lists, which Mav had spoke about a little bit before. Static lists are bad. Automation allows you to have dynamic, frequently changing lists. A good example of automating your data flow is you pull an asset list out of your asset management system, and that goes into your vulnerability management product in scan zones or asset groups or sites. And then that data then goes into results and organizing those results and tagging and reporting on those results. And all of that can be automated. When you are automating things, consider the ROI of whatever you're automating. If it's that 5-minute once a week job, but it's going to take you 2 weeks to automate that, that's probably not worth your time. Just keep letting them waste 5 minutes a week. And do automate individual tasks. Instead of the automating monolithically, all of those individual little pieces of that whole huge process, automate each one of those individually and then tie them together. That is more scalable and more maintainable and will cause you a lot less pain in the future. Now, notifications and alerts are an unfortunate part of threat and vulnerability management, and if you are receiving them, you probably know what I'm talking about, and if you're not, you probably should be. The biggest problem with them is triaging them. Don't depend on static emails. If you get an email for anything that your vulnerability management product finds, you're going to end up with a couple thousand emails that nobody's ever going to look at because there's a couple thousand of them.
Or they're on vacation.
Or they're on vacation. Don't alert for every individual finding, because that only exacerbates the email problem. If you're alerting on, hey, there's an informational alert for some banner grabbing that the product was doing, you don't need to know about that. That does not need alerted on. And all it does is make a couple thousand emails into a couple thousand more emails. And don't ticket every alert. I have seen where people would, for every single alert that was fired out of their vulnerability management product, they would have a separate ticket for that alert, which leads to the exact same problem as the email problem, where you have thousands that nobody's ever going to touch because there are thousands of them. Do automate. Automating saves everything. You can use your automation to ingest all of those emails or ingest alert data directly from your product using the API. And then once you've ingested that data, you can use things like just simple pattern matching can often help you organize and prioritize those alerts. But if you have the time and development skill, you can also look into things like fuzzy logic and machine learning to help better prioritize and score some kind of those alerts. Which leads into the next point, which is prioritization. Prioritize your alerts based on relevance and criticality. If you have, if there's an unauthenticated RCE vulnerability that you have, that's probably a little more important than upgrading Java. And please tune your alerts. There's no need to receive alerts that are useless and provide no value, like informational BS alerts that you don't care about. It drastically cuts down on all that noise before it reaches your hopefully burgeoning automation. Now, container scanning is comparatively new, and because of that, it's often neglected or forgot about or not even considered. And there are options for it. The big name vulnerability management vendors have integrations that you can use for container scanning, and there's also some open source container scanning products. Do not assume your containers are secure. They are not magical, impregnable little boxes that you can do whatever you want to with. Do not ignore best practices. It might be easier sometimes when building your containers to do things like this, but you still need to remember to avoid things like embedding sensitive information in your container image. Remember to drop root privileges when you're building your container. And automating the building of those images via various tools is okay, but don't blindly trust the templates that are given to you when you're building these things. And don't scan like it's a server, because it's not. All right, don't bother with credentialed network scans or agents. Your container, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Do scan regularly. These are just as important as your traditional infrastructure, sometimes more so. Scan them regularly. Don't do the once a quarter kind of stuff. And consider criticality. Some containers are more critical than others and should be treated as such. Just like if you have production containers that are exposed to the internet, you should probably look at those more frequently than random container running random service for a developer. Do scan your base images, and this is where I was starting to get ahead of myself. You should generally treat your containers as immutable, so scanning them while they're running should not be necessary. If you scan the base image of your container, that should be all you need, because it should not be changed. That, of course, kind of assumes a high level of maturity. Immutable infrastructure takes work to get to. But that is, if you are running containers at any kind of scale, that's the goal you should have in mind, is immutable infrastructure.
So this is a fun one that got trimmed back pretty heavily. A few people might have heard me go on web app scanning rants before. Aside from working for a vol management company, I previously worked for another consulting firm where I did manual application security. And so I have beefs about some of the ways that it's currently handled. If you want the long version of that, come talk to me, and we'll also post our slides. The short version is that there's generally two approaches to this. One is using your vulnerability management scanner, and the other one is integrating with the actual pipeline and deployment process. These require wildly different maturity levels, but definitely have pros and cons. Rather than doing do's and don'ts, I'm simply breaking it down to what a TVM scan might look like, which is just you're scanning the static web server, you're looking for XSS, SQLI. They're super slow, they're super long. This is partially because the vulnerability management scanner is not always the most ideal way to scan a large website, especially a heavily dynamic website that has lots of forms and fields and values. And a big problem is the visibility. Frequently, you're not doing vulnerability management scanning for web apps until it's already in prod or it's well past a development life cycle. If we move towards something like a pipeline and or integrating with QA, we can do things like scan source code repositories, do static analysis. Again, this is not utilizing standard vulnerability management tools, but there is definitely great value in getting to this maturity level. If you're doing things like looking at your source code, you can also do things like determine endpoints. So a vulnerability management product or web app scanner usually is just going to look for what it can find based on a site crawl, whereas if you're scanning your source code, you can find unknown endpoints that are actually exposed that might be invisible to you. Great thing to do is get involved with the actual development lifecycle. Hook Git. You don't necessarily have to block, but warn developers in their development process, hey, you're doing this thing and your code is dangerous. It's using unsafe functions. It's exposing credentials or secrets. Again, this goes way beyond just standard phone management web app scanning. And integrating with QA, there's a large amount of this that probably should just live with QA. There's a lot of products out there that are specifically built to do that, so that every time a release goes through the pipeline, QA is the group that gets all of the warnings and notifications for security findings, and they're the ones that are pushing that back to development rather than just coming from your security team. So due to the sheer amount of content we could put in here, some of the things we had to cut, some of the things we had to scale back, like the web app scanning. Our intention is to still release the full slide deck, including some of the other sections with do's and don'ts that we were not able to go into. This is a huge topic, and there is no single way to try and deliver as much knowledge as you can. I've done kind of one-off help for friends before that turned into multi-day things, and in the end I usually recommend get professional services from whoever your vuln management provider is. They will be able to give you what you really need. Questions, comments, heckles? Josh?
So you talked about container security. What about cloud, where things are dynamically spinning up, spinning down, and how do you get your hands around that?
So the cloud, this is also highly dependent on maturity, because even though the cloud is fully capable of being treated as traditional infrastructure, you shouldn't. The goal there is similar to containers, with the end goal being immutable infrastructure. So if you're at that point and you're that mature and you have immutable infrastructure, then you should do the same thing you're doing with containers and scan the base machine images. Like for AWS, scan or check the AMI, don't actually check the running machine. If you're not there and you are treating them as dynamic moving pieces, then a solid thing to do is bake your agent into that base image. Bake your agent into the AMI before you spin anything up, and then as soon as it's spun up, you'll have metrics on that machine.
That was the section we had to kind of scale back on a little bit just because of time. Yes?
So on serverless and software defined everything, are you seeing vulnerability management move more towards code review than actual access scanning?
So, and actually, I apologize, we should be repeating the questions. The first one was dealing with cloud, and this one is asking a bit about, are we seeing things move to more of a code integration and away from just static scanning? Yes, just within the last probably 4 or 5 years, most of the major vendors realized that they were very static asset lists, static groupings, and started adding integrations for other things like DHCP and AWS. I have a whole other talk I'd like to do at some point, which is basically security as a dinosaur. And a lot of immature companies are doing vulnerability management the old way, which is the static way, the non-integrated way. In this case, for containers and application scanning, those absolutely should integrate in with the pipeline. That doesn't necessarily mean that it moves out of vuln management, but it raises the question, is your vulnerability management group simply a single product, or is it a number of processes, integrations, life cycles that you're having to automate together to try and integrate with the rest of your company and all of those different practices?
So if security is a dinosaur, we can look forward to its extinction.
So if security is a dinosaur, we can look forward to its extinction. Well, in a sense, yes, because you could say, security is everyone's concern. Maybe what it is that it's not that security goes away, but the idea of a dedicated group of angry people that scream about security starts blending into the entire company and its processes and workflows, so that it shifts its focus from a group of technical people being angry.
Sounds more like evolution.
Yeah, evolution, there we go. Yeah. Very bad. Okay, yep, Miss?
I've heard the argument that if you add an agent onto a host, let's say, that it increases attack surface. So would you do anything extra if you add an agent on there?
So yeah, the two most common complaints with agents is either it uses more resources, and we have too many of those, which frequently my experience with that is they really don't use that much more, and it's not a huge issue. But as far as it being a broader attack surface, yeah, most agents tend to run as root and are not, in my opinion, ideal, and it's where we as customers need to push back on our vendors to really be getting them to build better agents. When you do credentialed scanning, you can choose to use a regular non-root account, but most of the vendors support utilizing sudo or some other escalation. But with agents, I think all the ones I've seen, they're root and there's nothing else. So I would say that is not ideal, and that is where you can fall back on credential-based scanning if you need. But I think we, as a customer base, need to push back on the vendors to build us better agents. Yeah, right behind you.
So I have another question related to agents. You were talking a little bit earlier about putting agents on containers. As far as products that you're aware of, are there any that kind of are smart about the licensing there and don't add to your licensing burden and that kind of stuff?
So, is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. We generally recommend against agents on containers. That was for agents on cloud if you have a dynamic sort of cloud environment. What was the rest of the question?
So with containers, I think, and it depends on the vendor, that sometimes the ability to container scan is a totally separate license that may be exclusive of whatever your IP count is for your vuln scanning. You have to look into that with your product vendor because they're not all the same. That also plays back into the license model is shifting because of container and cloud.
Right.
So while I don't think the vendors have fully figured that out yet for the future, I think they're working on it. And it's kind of like with scan engines or Nessus scanners. They used to charge you separately for the scanner, and eventually many of the vendors realized we can't do that. We need to be able to allow them to have more scanners and instead license on features or IP. So I can't say where they're going to go with it, but yeah, scanning your cloud infrastructure of 10,000 or 100,000 AWS instances, if you do have to go the agent route, that'll kick back on your license.
I guess the thing that I'm kind of confused about is putting an agent on the cloud host doesn't necessarily get you anything about the container, does it? Like, that's the thing I'm confused about. Is like, let's say your container has outdated packages, for example. How do you protect that from, or how do you include that in a vulnerability management program?
So at least two of the major vendors I know of will integrate with your container platform by looking at your registry, where they're looking at the images, I think, not the containers. And that goes back to the maturity model and being immutable, that your container should be identical to your image, so you don't need an agent on the container because you should scan your image. And in the cloud for AWS or GCP, if you're at that maturity level, it's the same. If you're not at that maturity level, you're probably putting an agent in your EC2 instance or whatever. But the idea is that that stuff is immutable, like he said. You have follow-on addition?
No, you covered that pretty well.
All right. Well,
Any other questions?
I think that might be it. So again, we'll try and release these. I'm not sure, I forget, does LASCON have any way to facilitate that? Sweet. So we will try and get those up. As I say, we put a whole bunch of other stuff in here that we needed to just kind of cut back on. And this is a big topic, so feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to continue this conversation. And we're hoping to continue to revise and improve the talk, so feedback is welcome. We'd like to still give it to a couple other local conferences and groups around the area.
Thanks so much.